While traditional database technologies will persist for years, the advent of streaming data continues to reshape the information landscape. For many mission critical use cases, the value of real time analytics is a game changer. And as cost structures continue to shift, the price performance for a streaming first architecture looks better by the day. Find out in this episode of Future Proof.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, here with Christopher Sachs of Swim. And yes, software in motion, that's the acronym that comes up with SWIM. That's where the name comes from. So we're going to talk today about the inflection point. Are we at that inflection point for streaming first architecture? Short answer is I think we are at the beginning of it, quite frankly. Now, there's a lot of legacy hardware and software and systems and mindsets out there. It takes a long time usually to change those sorts of things unless you have some massive event that kind of wakes people up, like COVID, for example, a forcing function to change what is going on in the world. But the bottom line is that we've always wanted to have streaming. We've always wanted as close to real time as we can. But what you have typically in the enterprise software world is this real sort of persist first mentality. You even see that with technologies like Kafka from Confluent, which came out of LinkedIn, of course, where it persists to disk first, and then you go and use it. Now, they, in recent days, have said they have a different approach around that, and they may be solving that problem. But the point is, persist first, ask questions later has long been the rule of the day, and that's how we operate. And so what you do is you optimize how fast you put the data into the warehouse. You optimize how fast you get it back out of the warehouse, for example. But nonetheless, you're putting it in the warehouse for some period of time. And so there is a latency, there's a lag, for example, and that is okay for many business use cases, but it's not okay for all use cases. Certainly for fraud detection, it's not very okay. For network operations, it's not very okay. Because especially if you're running a telco, like if you're Verizon, for example, or any other large telco, you've got this incredibly complex environment where it takes sometimes hours just to get a snapshot of what the world even looks like today, like right now. So what good does that do you to wait 4 hours before you can see what the heck is happening in your network? That's when calls get dropped, people get upset, they change, they churn is the word that they use for that. And typically when you churn from a telco, you're not going back anytime soon. I mean, I'm old enough to remember AT&T. We want you back. They had a whole campaign around that because they lost so much business to competitors, and they had a sort of come to Jesus moment, if you will, and said, oh, well, guess what? We got to just admit our mistakes and come out there and tell the world what's going on. And you've kind of seen this, the innovation in the telco world, but also in this whole streaming environment. It's been happening for a while now. If you look at the VoIP space, I mean, that's 20 odd years ago that it started. Well, I was at a company, a fantastic company, the Data Warehousing Institute, and they brought in this VoIP system, and it was absolutely dreadful. It was just so bad because within 5-10 minutes of a conversation, you start getting these weird artifacts. And then you get conversations where someone says, I really want you. You're like, what did you say? This is the business phone line. Like, I was like, guys, we have to transact business. Are you basically saying that what you're saying doesn't matter? Because that's kind of what you're saying. You're using a solution that doesn't allow fluid communication of critical information. Guess what? You're dropping the ball. You're basically saying that what we're doing doesn't matter. Well, that's crazy talk. So now, as we see the streaming first approach kind of take off, I think it is going to rewrite a lot of the rules for how business gets done. And it's the kind of thing where once you have it, it's really hard to go back. It's just like visibility, quite frankly. I'm an email marketing guy. I remember it was 22 years ago, I started using a solution where I could see who opened and who clicked. And I was like, wow, that's cool. Now I know who to follow up with. In fact, I built a list. This was the beginning of my database 22 years ago. I built a list of consultancies in business intelligence because I wanted to focus on that space. And I sent out a blast with some information. And then I sat back and I looked at the results. and I sorted them from the top down to the most opens to the least opens. And the top 5 had like 29 opens, 17 opens, 12 opens, 11 opens, 10 opens. And you go all the way down, it's like 5, 3, 2, 1, 1, 1, etc. I know who to call first. I just go to the top of the list. I call that guy. Then let's go to the second guy. So you know how to prioritize. I talked about this at a conference earlier. Prioritization is about the most important thing you can do in business ever. What do you work on right now? Unless you're a fireman where you know what to do to put out fires, it's hard to know what to do exactly. So visibility leads to awareness, improves your decision-making capability to do what's next in the next moment and not have to wait for something. Once you wait, no one likes to wait. No one likes to sit around and wait. Not even baseball players. You see, they step out of the box if it takes too long to kind of recalibrate themselves and to get back in to hit that home run. Good for the Astros, by the way. I was rooting for the Phillies a little bit, but anyway. But with that, let me hand it off to Christopher Sachs of Swim, who has built a whole architecture, basically a new technology stack with this sort of thing in mind. Chris, tell us about streaming first architectures. Where are we in the game, and what do you see coming down the pipe?
Yeah, so I think the sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you will, of businesses has evolved. And if you think of, this idea in psychology that, first you need to make sure you have food, right? It's like, when you don't have food, like what kind of iPhone you have doesn't matter, right? And then you need like shelter and security and sort of list goes on. And there's sort of a similar progression on the enterprise front, like to your point, like the first thing, making a phone call, being able to successfully make a phone call is good. Once you've mastered that, then you want to be able to prioritize, right? You want that business intelligence so you can prioritize who you call. And then you want to optimize that experience, make sure you understand the trends of who is likely to respond. And so you get big data, right? And you're able to optimize and figure out the audience segments to target. But one of the things that happens next or especially for large enterprises, that sort of moves down that hierarchy of needs is eventually you want to start automating. Especially if you have a big complex enterprise, like if you're a teleco or Uber or Instacart or FedEx, you have these big complex operations. Okay, great. They can communicate reliably. Check. They've got analytics to understand where they have inefficiencies that they can connect. Check. Now they're faced with this problem of they have lots of data, they have lots of insights, but it takes a lot of manual labor often, and in sort of error-prone decision making to sort of keep things running well. And this is where streaming data enters the picture. The idea is, well, why can't we take this streaming data and have computers do what they do best and do things over and over again? Now, the challenge is when it comes to automation, like time really matters. And I'll give a concrete example. If let's say you've got a cable modem, for your internet, and sometimes that goes down. Right? It would be nice if instead of you having to call the cable company and be like, why, my internet's not working, it would be great if they could figure that out themselves, right? And remediate the problem, automatically. But what would be a disaster, the worst thing that they could do is say your, cable modem has a problem and it fails, but then it restarts and comes back up. Then an hour later, some analytic runs and said that, figures out, oh my gosh, Eric Kavanaugh's, cable modem failed. We better restart it. But this is an hour later, and they go and restart a cable modem that's already corrected itself, right? So when you're talking about automation, like latency really matters, and being real time really matters because you need to be sort of in sync with reality. And so that's kind of the next, the next threshold in sort of these hierarchy of needs of enterprises. And streaming data plays an important role in that. And real time has new significance. It's no longer, I think, historically, people think of real time as like, okay, if I reload a web page, how quickly does it come back? And they think, I don't need real time. It's okay if it takes a half second. But what we're talking about is something very different. We're talking about automation and responsiveness. And you have to be sure if you're making a control decision, you better be sure that your input data is actually representative and sort of time coherent with the real world. And that calls for, in our existing software architectures don't deal with that situation very well. And so the question is, what we really need is a streaming first architecture that is optimized for that problem. And one of the questions is, do we end up with a split where you have streaming first architectures dealing with these real-time problems, and you have sort of, legacy architectures doing everything else, or how much convergence can there be is one of the questions.
Yeah, the classic impedance mismatch, right? And this is something I talked about with Jay Craps about 7 years ago, as I gave him an analogy to what they were building, which is like the interstate highway system compared to the old road systems. You can still use the old roads, they'll just take you longer, right? If you get on the highway, the interstate highway, you get a lot faster. They were designed for tanks, right? They were designed to carry tanks from one side of the country to the other. God forbid if we got attacked by someone and tanks showed up on our shores. Hopefully that'll never happen. But that's why they built this whole interstate highway system. And that's kind of how I view the streaming first world, is it's sort of a superstructure that kind of is above the rest of it. And then the key is to focus on those on-ramps and off-ramps. Like, how do you pull out of that and go into your traditional systems to be able to enable business people to see things and make decisions or whatever? But that's certainly not an impossible task. That's something that you guys do in your business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's useful to draw an analogy here to be, we're talking like streaming data seems kind of abstract. I mean, that's one of the challenges with a lot of sort of big data and software pieces. It's all, the cloud just inherently is this abstract idea. And I think there are sort of useful analogies to broadcast media, right? Which is about streaming data, frankly, right? I mean, this show right now is being streamed. Like, this is not some alien, like there's this, I feel like this perception that streaming data is this alien thing. Like, what do we do about it? Like it's incomprehensible. No, it is very comprehensible. You're participating in it right now. Right. We're just talking about doing it for things that are not video. Right. But the principles are similar. But one analogy you can think of is that, right? So the way the data space works today, you can think of with broadcast media, there was this idea of time shifting that arose kind of, really with the, the adoption of the VCR, but became kind of more prevalent as a term with TiVo. The idea, well, the data is broadcast live, but you can capture it and play it back later. Mm-hmm. And really most of, like, you can think of a database as really just it's a software system for time shifting. Right, it receives data at one time, and it's like a database is TiVo for data, right? You capture data and you can play it back later. Maybe you play it back way later, and not all databases are used this way, but often they are. And so the question is, well, do you force every application to time shift? So the way we try and do part of the reason streaming data is so difficult to deal with today, and why it's expensive and complicated and people are sort of afraid of it, I think, is that the way we deal with streaming data is we time shift it. We force everything to go into a database or persistent storage, but we try and time shift it as little as possible. Right. So we're like, okay, well, we're going to TiVo it, but we're going to only lag it by a second, or 5 seconds. So we're going to like hit record and then, record a 5-second mini batch is the term. And then we're going to pause, rewind, play that back, and then record another little 5-second batch. And it's extremely awkward and difficult. But that's not because streaming, and that gives this perception that streaming data is limited, that you can only do, solve real-time problems with it. But that's really an artifact of just how we use the technology. And it's not a requirement to do it that way.
Yeah, I love this. A database is like TiVo for data.
Right.
That is pretty funny, right? And like forcing it, I love this idea that you had, forcing every piece of data to go through a database first before it gets where it wants to go in the business is like forcing everyone to go through Blockbuster to get their movies. It just doesn't make sense. It's a barrier. In a sense, for certain real-time applications, a database is a barrier. It slows things down, and it could also have problems, right? Databases have different speeds depending upon what the workload is, depending upon what it's doing when the query comes in, for example. You could get it back right away. You could get it back not right away. It could fail. Queries fail. That happens all the time. So you are inserting an unnecessary hurdle in the stream for certain use cases, right?
Right, but I think it's important to note when we talk about streaming first, nothing about that precludes a database. Nothing about that precludes time shifting or playing back later. What I'm really advocating for is just have the option. Don't require everything to be time shifted. And I'd like to point out, live TV, guess what? It can also broadcast pre-recorded content, right? Just because you're streaming first doesn't mean you are only live, right? And this show is we're like a living example of this right now. Like you do this with DM radio every week. It's a live show, but guess what? You can listen to it later. You can also time shift it, but you can only go one direction. If you have a streaming first architecture, you can also do time shifted data. Now, but you can't but Blockbuster cannot serve you live TV. It doesn't go the other way. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why streaming architectures will all ultimately be dominant, even for non-real-time scenarios, just because it's the more universal way of doing things. If you can live stream, you can also broadcast his, pre-recorded content, but you can't go the other way.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's not an either or. And that's really important to understand. And what I'll point out to our audience here is that, I've been tracking the analytics space now for over 20 years, which is a pretty long time for this industry. And I can tell you that right now we're seeing a real renaissance in terms of real-time analytics, of people wanting to get it right away. And you see all sorts of different technologies coming up to do that. There's a company, Rockset, there's a company, Imply. We actually talked to in Austin, actually, with Chris a few weeks ago. There are like 7 or 8 of these companies that are cropping up, and this is usually how things happen. There's an awareness about a need or a capability. Sometimes the capability comes before the need, quite frankly, or they haven't quite sorted out the need. So they have an idea to build something better, faster, stronger, whatever. So they build that thing and they go looking for use cases and markets, and that's what venture capital does. It floats you long enough until you can go out and find the clients and bring back the revenue and create a nice revenue stream. But point being, this is a whole new space that's evolving. And I think what the folks at Swim have done is really they got ahead of the curve here a bit, and they saw what was happening, and they recognized the need for this, especially in telco, but in lots of other spaces too. And so they started building out this solution to be able to spread the software out at the edge in particular. And if you cut your teeth at the edge, well, you learn to deal with things like low latency or high latency in some cases. You learn to deal with not getting a signal and having to normalize for that. You learn to deal with low power. You really have to think like they used to way back in the early days of the mainframe, when you had to write really tight code to make sure stuff worked efficiently. And then processors got fast and operating systems got more robust. And so you could kind of change that a little bit, and you didn't have to be as tight. That's what led to something called code bloat. I always love that term, code bloat. I learned it once. I was like, what does that mean? And the developer explained to me, well, when the processors got fast, all of a sudden we didn't have to be as careful, didn't have to be as neat, because it would still get done. Well, guess what? When you scale out, especially to some massive scale, all those little inefficiencies are going to multiply and become big problems for you to solve. And then you have workarounds, and then you have all sorts of other things you do to deal with that. But don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. All right, folks, Eric Kavanaugh back here on Software in Motion, and I just thought of another fun little story to throw out there. Years ago with the wife, she took me to see a speaker from the Himalayan Institute, and he was this wonderful man, this adorable little man who gave this talk about the secret to happiness. And I was like, well, that sounds pretty good. Why don't you tell me what that is, friend? And he did. It's a one-word answer, and the answer was compassion, which I thought was very interesting. It wasn't love, it was compassion. He said, the more compassionate you are, the happier you're going to be over the course of your life. I'm like, that's pretty deep. But he also said some other really interesting things, and he talked about how successful America has been. And I asked him, well, why do you think it is successful? And he says, because you have freedom. You have freedom of speech and you have freedom of enterprise. And he said, in an environment where you have that in your culture, things are going to go well, because people will be happy if they can do what they want to do. And that's a beautiful thing. And so that's really what we're talking about here with a streaming first architecture. It's streaming first, not streaming only. You can do for all the persistence you want and all these other things, that's fine. But when you let people do things their way, things that they want to do, usually it works out pretty well. Now, sometimes you have to offer some guidance. Oh, don't do this, watch out for that. You know, the guardrails, so to speak, you want to worry about those things. But the point is that freedom of enterprise is at the very heart and soul of the American dream and of what we do in the business world. And I'm quite sure that it is, in fact, a reason why we have been so successful, is that people can do what they want. They can choose this direction or that direction as long as you can pay for it or find a way to get money for it. You can do what you want. And that, I think, is one of the most exciting things about the streaming first approach, because you're really trying to relay to people that you can do things your way. And you see this all the time in the enterprise. Every company is different. There's different strengths, different people, different approaches, protocols, business models, and it's very difficult to come up with a sort of an ERP system to solve all of that. That's why SAP has all these different modules to try to fit this business model and that business model. They're very, very different things. So if you can instead have a sort of composable architecture where you've got these different component parts that you can bring in that allow you to swiftly pivot and do things in different ways, that's the key to long-term success in a rapidly changing world. But what do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I would add to that the freedom to fail. I think is one of the keys to success in our civilization, right? If the freedom, you can't have that freedom without allowing things to fail that are not working. And that's what allows you to try lots of things and see what works. And you know what? If it turns out that streaming first is, just doesn't work and doesn't solve problems, it will fail, and that's a good thing. It should. At the same time, if a streaming first architecture is able to solve sort of cutting edge business problems, allow them to automate and give them observability and add more composability in the stack, then it will succeed on its merits. And there will be, my best guess is I take I'm rather on the extreme end, for obvious reasons, on the streaming first approach. And that, my view is, well, why would you ever not stream anything? And I will grant that I am probably, wrong. I am probably too far on that spectrum there. But that's okay, because, I want to push. It's, my view is you'll only learn like what the limits are if you really push on them and seek to find them. Actually, I'll give just one concrete example. So our stack sort of builds in persistence, and we, the idea is, well, computing is always in memory, right? That's just how like processors work. Like you literally can't compute any other way. It's actually like computing out of a cache or a register. But so we have, but you don't. We live in a world of a lot of data, and all the data you might want to work with doesn't. We talk about the world not fitting on disk. Well, it doesn't fit in memory either.
Right.
And so, you do need persistence. And so we have a local storage engine. The idea being that, well, if it doesn't fit in memory, you can at least spill over to a local disk. Now, ironically, we've come at a time where all the disks are being removed from servers. And so you go to like Amazon, and it's basically impossible to get it's also very expensive to get attached disks, partly because of, this is where you get into these interesting dynamics of, that you have all these feedback loops in the industry. Well, most like application workloads were writing to a database, so they had no need for local disks. So Amazon just removed them. And so now our sort of local persistence engine isn't that useful because ironically, like the disks aren't there. But that's okay. So, we persist to, you don't have to go, it doesn't, to the point of it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And the industry will dial in what that balance is. I'll probably continue sort of, beating my fist for like, let's take it as far as we can. Others who are wiser and more pragmatic will say, yeah, we'll take these parts that are useful. And we'll keep our database, because we like it, and that's great. That's how the market should work.
Yeah, and you had a good quote in your notes here about a Bill Gates comment: people overestimate what can happen in 5 years, but underestimate what can happen in 10. And those timescales are probably shortening now, right? I mean, it's kind of amazing. I was at the AT&T store with my Samsung S10, and I was asking him a question about like adding space for basically hard drive or for storage, and he pointed out, it's like none of the other guys even use that technology anymore. It's like, it wasn't that long ago I bought this phone, and like the actual fabric of the phone is changing, right? So the form factor keeps changing, and it's a wild woolly world. I mean, things change quickly, and you have to be able to kind of change with them. And what I will go back to again here is with the streaming first approach, it's more like real life. We're in a streaming first architecture. People think like that, right? And we're able to change topics, change our minds very quickly without any sort of impedance at all. Like you can have a conversation with one person and then the phone rings and you have a completely different conversation, and there was no trouble with that at all. Right? You didn't block up some system or the system wasn't working slowly. I mean, so that's what you want in the business world with your information systems is you want that fluidity where you can go from doing this at top speed to stopping and doing something else at top speed when that observability comes in and knocks on your door and tells you that you got a problem, right?
Yeah, it's interesting though because sometimes we do lose capabilities, and as a society, like so we've like lost Blockbuster as a capability, right?
Right.
And that's okay, and I think this is part of the the Bill Gates quote of people overestimate what can happen in 5 years and underestimate what can happen in 10. It's amazing in 10 years how like just even having watching my kids grow up. My daughter is 8, I think.
Yeah,
It's
right.
like there's a good sort of benchmark of nearly a decade, and going from like no smartphones to, I mean, it like just how and I think partly it's like you fixate on the technology for a while, and then it's not until about 10 years on that you sort of take stock of the social change that's been a consequence. I'll just throw up one other thing. I remember I was in like Italy in early 2000 with my dad, and he picked up the phone in a hotel room, and he was like, "Son, this is what a full duplex phone line sounds like." And he was like talking to my sister in the other room, and it was like, great, there's like no delay, it's like really crisp. I was like, what the hell
Wow.
are you talking about? But that's something we actually don't have. Like
Wow.
we actually all have, right? We all switched to packet switch networks instead of circuit switch networks, and they're way better. Phones are way cheaper, but you do lose certain things
Interesting.
in the process, and that's what kind of where nostalgia comes from, right? Is longing for those little things that we miss, but there's usually good reasons for the trade-offs. But it's exciting time to watch things change, and we'll see where we end up. So like the lack of discs is another example. So who knows what amazing capabilities we'll have and what things we'll lose that we never expected we'd lose.
Yeah, and it goes back to the importance of future-proofing your architecture and really kind of thinking through how you're going to be able to manage the changes, right? Because things do change, and we've seen prices change. I mean, look how quickly gas prices change. We've seen inflation spike in very unpleasant ways. That's a forcing function. That's going to force you to look at things differently, to drive less maybe, or pay more for things, or just do things differently. We would do it all the time. And in the enterprise, what you want to do is avail yourself of the best, right? That's the key. Is if you want to succeed, you want to avail yourself of the best technology, the best people, the best processes, and allow yourself to fail quickly. And we were joking before the show about Elon Musk buying Twitter, and he's going to start doing things differently, right? And you see the ripple effects, and you can tell that he enjoys it, right? You can tell he gets a charge out of this, about the blue check thing. And I was talking about a fascinating move to say, yes, for $8 a month, you can have this blue check if we verify you, etc. And of course, then there's a payment method associated with that. So it should tamp down on the trolls a little bit. And it turns it into a much more egalitarian type approach, as opposed to the lords and peasants, which was before. And it's funny seeing all the lords complain. Well, the peasants are like, yay, give me the blue check for $8. So I got no problem with that. But folks, this has been so much fun in this series. All the other shows are online, so look it up, Software in Motion. Look up Christopher Sachs on LinkedIn. Swim.inc is the website. Very, very cool stuff, folks. Streaming first architectures, they're coming. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to Software in Motion.